Chapter 14. Dirty Little Secrets. When the flashing line was halted, David, Ashley, and Trace were no-shows the day prior. A couple of pre-op setups had been iced. As a result, Dee spent the next morning sending out feelers to certain contacts to reorganize the hit on the DOE. Got a lot of moving parts on this hit, and you three taking a hike in the woods fucked everything up, she mumbled in her French accent following a 60-second phone call where all she had said was, "It's on, tonight, same time as what was planned before." She quickly disconnected the line. Like everyone in the organization, she used a burner phone to make the calls to get the operation back up and running. During this time, Trace spent some time tweaking his laptop, messing around with some tech the Nex of DC had in her dusty old pawn shop, and sleeping. These could come in handy. Trace had brought up at one point as he was toying around with the junk. "What is it exactly, Trace?" Ashley had asked. Her and David had been sitting around, and although David wasn't totally sure about Ashley, he was mentally preparing for whatever they may encounter in the coming events. He knew something this big would result in a fight no matter how much planning went into it, which also meant people would die, and he needed to remind himself it was the same as on The Flash, them or him. Trace answered Ashley's question, snapping him out of his mental preparation. "They are old school head cams, like what they strapped onto soldiers' heads back in the early 2020s. If I tweak them some, I think I can get them working again, and we can record what goes down in the DOE building." David nodded in agreement. "That ain't a bad idea, Trace. Any chance you can, get it to send the recordings to a safe place, in case, David said, not wanting to finish the thought out loud to discourage anyone. But the truth was there. No one had ever hit a major federal branch like the Department of Energy, or any federal buildings for that matter, tech company offices, or power plants. It always resulted in capture or death, and David did not plan to get pinched tonight. "Yeah, man, shouldn't be too hard. The tech was made to stream the video across the world back when the feds used them. I can get it linked up to a console here, get some dummy code set up right before we head out, and hopefully keep them from routing where the feed is going," Trace replied. But it was all so techy, and not in David's wheelhouse of knowledge. He was able to understand the first part, the not too hard part. "Cool, man? Then it sounds like we can put on a little show tonight," David said with a smile on his face as he looked over at Ashley. David also took the time to get to know the other two operators a little more as the day passed and they prepped for the job. Brick was a colossus of a human, and the extensive body modifications he had undergone in his life made him look even more inhuman. David wondered how things like steel-plated bones would age. No doubt, he thought, by the time Brick was in his 60s, if he even lived that long, he probably wouldn't be able to function like a normal person. Even his teeth had been capped with steel, making his bite dangerous even to his own tongue. David estimated he weighed around 400 and some change with the plating, but without, he was most likely closer to mid-300, which meant as age caught up with him, the extra weight on his body, on top of the long-term damage to his bones where the steel had been drilled in, David only needed to assume Brick would be a cripple in his old age. He learned, though with great difficulty considering Brick didn't say more than 4 words at a time to him, that Brick was 39 years old. His time with the cartel had left him covered in tattoos, and to the best of David's understanding, he was called a sicario, a brutal hitman with little to no empathy for those he brutalized. Brick was still human, though, and David asked him why he went against the cartel and chem farm when he hit up a warehouse that was protected by the cartel. Brick's red and black eyes flicked over to David. "I had a sister," he said simply at first. Oh, how David loved half answers where he needed to keep prying at Brick to get the full story. But shockingly, Brick started up again before David needed to ask anything. Some piece of shit rich boy who oversaw the warehouse saw her in a club one night. The entitled little piece of shit decided the world was his, including her. He drugged her up with a spiked-up brain raid, fucked her while she was ODing in a bathroom. Once he was done with her, he just left her to die in her own vomit. The story was gruesome, especially with the bluntness in which Brick spoke about his sister's rape and death. "How young was she? How did you know it was him?" David asked, with control over the fear bubbling up inside of him, worried he was pushing too much and would piss Brick off. Brick just kept that dead stare locked on David. She was 16, and he didn't feel the need to keep quiet about what he did. To him, she was just some bum-spick bitch he could use as he pleased, Brick said, in his gravelly, harsh voice. Who was he? David asked again, still wanting to know the whole story. Brick sighed, showing a shocking version of humanity, and pulled out a bottle of spiced rum he had in a little cubby in what appeared to be his section of the shop's back office. Taking a large gulp, he answered, His name was Deshaun Regis, or something I don't remember now. Just some rich boy from L.A. in the West Commonwealth. His family was able to use its wealth to land him a job with Chem Farm. I didn't have to look hard to find his ass. Just go to the Chem Farm warehouse and wait for him to show. Once I saw him, I grabbed that fuck and ripped his ass in half like a fucking wishbone. Some guards tried to get involved. It ended with the whole warehouse going down. My superiors didn't like that much. Brick's story was a graphic depiction of the elitist and the lesser class, making David feel like his little runaway story was quite dull in comparison. Dee was harder to crack open. David was able to get from her, she was 45, and had spent a long time preforming wet work for shadowy French government types. All you Americans seem to think the world isn't as bad as what it used to be. The truth is, it's worse. Sure, they got almost everyone that doesn't matter, drugged up to the point where they don't question a single thing. They don't ask more questions than needed because, hey, they told us crime is almost entirely gone. But let me ask you something, boy toy. Your little field trip into our world. Does it feel like crime and corruption is almost gone? David knew this was a loaded question from Dee. She wanted him to fall into the simple trap that he assumed everyone fell into when asked. Blame the governments and blame the wealthy. But this was something he had been deep in thought about since his revelation in Pittsburgh. Corruption and crime are human nature. It doesn't matter what side anyone takes. At some point we all break a rule. The Fed, the tech giants, the megacorp that own most of the world's assets and its people. They are corrupt to the bone. I want to know why and how, and then I want to show the rest of the world. But we aren't clean either. Just look at this little group right now. Brick is a butcher. You killed in the shadows for a broken government body. Trace is a killer and lifelong lowlife, and now I'm a killer too, David said, hoping his statement put Dee on the defensive for once. She smiled at him with only one side of her mouth. Well said. None of us are clean. Not even your little princess over there. We all gotta bleed or make someone bleed for what we believe in. Whatever it is for each person. The question isn't who's on the right side. It's which side can you stomach to be with. After what I saw, I'd rather be on the side where at least we are monsters spreading some truth for once, she said. Then she stood up to prepare the equipment and patted David's shoulder as she passed him. David also spent some time around the old woman who was called Nex in this area. She was a fossil of a time well past. David hoped this meant she could give him something that his Nex, Jason, and his father's notebook couldn't. She was very much an old woman, though. She got caught up in small things that took up an ungodly amount of time. She was hard of hearing as well, which made conversations a barrier. She was close to 90 and had been with the organization since its start. Oh, it's hard to pinpoint anything so official as when this all came to be, she mused. I can only say with certainty, I got in way back around 2010. Even then, I wasn't a spring chicken. But my husband was a career military man, and during one of those spring-up wars that we seemed to get involved in every other year back then, he was killed. Blown up in a factory in Russia. It ruined me, and then I heard from a friend who heard from a friend that there were others just as ruined as me. The rest, I suppose, is obvious. Was that when you guys came up with the eagle image? David asked her. She looked at him confused for a moment, like she wasn't sure she had heard his question all the way through. As he was preparing to repeat himself slightly louder, she spoke up. Well, that eagle image, as you call it, was something that was already a part of it. They used it to mark safe havens for the early joiners, and it sort of just stuck around. She paused her story to fiddle with a hard candy wrapper. After about a 2-minute battle with it, she was victorious and put the hard candy into her mouth and offered one to David, who said, "No thank you," hoping she wouldn't lose her train of thought. Then she sat back some in her seat and looked for a moment, as if she might decide to take an afternoon nap, but then continued her story. It has 2 meanings. The eagle, as you see it, was supposed to in fact represent the bald eagle bird for the old USA, but the image's deeper meaning was regarding some Egyptian goddess. I used to be good at pronouncing it. Nekbet. In the Egyptian mythos, she was the protector of the pharaohs. She was meant as a sign of protection. So, we just took to making the eagles on our symbol look like her, to protect ourselves and what we know to be true. That's how it was pitched to me all those years back. It all clicked suddenly for him. The reason why this version of the eagle was so familiar and yet different. Back during his school days, as they briefly covered world history in about 1 week, he remembered the one lecture they had on Egypt, and looking through the 5 pages of his class textbook that covered the subject, he saw a very similar image to what the organization used. This also made him realize that his time in school covered entire centuries of human history in a matter of 1 or 2 classes. Thinking about the logistics of that was absurd. How was anyone supposed to remember or care about anything if it's all just cliff notes with no deeper meaning? No wonder everything and everyone seemed so dull and ready to take Chembal. There was no real in-depth education at the basic levels of elementary and high school. Even when David went to college after his mandatory military service, his degree was in federal office medication compliance work, aka the shit he was doing for a living. He realized that for the most part, he learned nothing in elementary, in high school, or even college. All the things he knew were from his own occasional curiosity. After all was said and done, he decided then and there he was going to find old books, old films, anything old, and absorb its information. He wanted to learn. A few hours had passed, and the sun was setting outside. Each of them had begun to gear up for the events about to begin. Dee wore a full bodysuit made of a form-fitting fabric that was similar to spandex, but David assumed it had some protective qualities. She wore black boots that had softer soles on the bottom, so if needed she could better move silently. A gun belt with a pistol and some magazines for a sniper rifle she planned to bring along. Brick wore a black tank top with a reinforced vest, black combat pants and heavy black boots. The size of him made it clear that unlike Dee, he wasn't planning on trying to sneak around. He was wearing gloves that had a padding on them that was to protect his skin in case he needed to punch anything harder than another human's head. Just because his fist could now rip through certain objects that other people couldn't, didn't mean his skin could withstand the blow itself. So, he had to protect his skin in those cases. He also had a gun belt and pistol, as well as bringing a combat shotgun. Trace, Ashley, and David wore more simplistic outfits. Black shirts, black bulletproof vests, dark jeans, and of course boots like Dee and Brick. David was bringing his father's gun and a simple assault rifle supplied by the Old Necks. Trace and Ashley were outfitted with similar gear, except obviously for Trace's bag of tech goodies that was needed most of all for this hit. Trace handed each of them a headset with an attached cam so they could start filming and streaming communication into a device he had put together in the back of the pawn shop. They waited in the back by the loading dock for their pickup. The silence was intense, and Ashley reached out for David's hand as they stood in the silence. The sound of a truck pulling up to the loading dock broke the silence of the room, and not long after the truck stopped moving, there was a rapping of knuckles on the loading dock door. "Who is it?" asked Dee. An older man's voice came back in reply. "An all-black unmarked stolen truck that nobody knows is here." Dee opened the loading door. The elderly man had already turned his back and began walking to the driver's seat. He clearly had no intention of seeing any of their faces and didn't want them to see his. They all jumped in the back of the truck. Brick turned around and closed both the loading door and then the truck's doors. There was a moment when nothing happened, then a locking sound from the other side. In a few more minutes, the truck started to move again. There was very little light in the back of the truck, but David was sitting next to Trace and Ashley. The smells of both the truck and the people in the back with him was gross. The truck had a musty stench reminding David of the locker room smell of his youth. Brick smelt, oddly like burnt hair for some reason, and hard liquor. Trace had solid BO odor that David assumed was intensified by his nervous sweating. Dee was too far on the other side to know if she had a stench about her. David leaned into Ashley's hair to try and mask the smell of the place around them. She leaned into him. Again, he didn't know exactly what she was thinking right at that moment, but he was preparing himself for anything. It was about a 20-minute ride before it slowed down and stopped. The back door unlocked, and they opened it. David looked out before anyone else and saw that they were right in the back lot of the DOE building. The old man was already back at the front of the truck. They stepped out, David and Trace at the same time, then Dee and Brick and Ashley as the last two. They moved towards a back door that required security clearance to pass through. Then Brick moved up to the front of the pack. David thought to himself, if the plan goes south here, he could just rip the damn thing open. Maybe. Then Brick straightened up his posture and knocked 4 times hard on the door. There was a moment of nothing, then the door opened. A security officer for the building opened the door. He stared blankly at Brick, then David and Trace, and finally at Dee and Ashley. You the ones? Good, then we are gone. We anticipate you got 20 minutes before people start wondering what's going on and send a squad to investigate. Most anyone in there that would cause you issue is incapacitated, the guard said to them in a deep voice. Then he moved out towards them, and 10 other security officers followed with him as they walked towards the truck. Without looking at them, the old man spoke up. Once I get them where they gotta go to start some new lives, I'll try to be back for you. If it's too hot, then it's too hot, and you will have to get out on your own. That's our deal. Dee spoke up in reply. That's our deal. Then they entered the building. They moved quickly. Dee moved like a cat, making near no sounds. Trace ran flat-footed, and David noted just how uncoordinated Trace was when it came to any type of physical activity. Ashley moved like her whole body had been trained to run, which it had been, but never with a gun in her hands, and the look of nerves on her face let David know this was all still intense for her. Brick's jog made the area around him seem to give off vibrations. It reminded David of when Matthew would walk quickly through the office, and the fatness of his body made the general area around him shake. As for David himself, his jog was simply put, like the one he was taught in boot camp. He knew how to hold a gun while running, but he didn't have any fancy grace in his step like Dee. They got to a section where there were 3 paths to take. Trace stopped and got down quickly on one knee. During this brief stopping period, David realized how fast his heart was beating. It wasn't from their little dramatic jogging session. It was pure adrenaline and nerves kicking in. Here they were, in the belly of the beast. Nobody had ever pulled something like this and got away with it. There was no certainty they would either, and it was really starting to hit home with him just how out of depth he was in this situation. He closed his eyes and took silent, deep breaths. He didn't want anyone to see just how much he was freaking out. He was starting to sweat heavily, and he was getting tunnel vision. Fuck am I wigging out over here, he thought to himself as he closed his eyes again and taking in a deep breath. We go left here, Trace said as he looked at a schematic on his laptop. Then he closed it quickly, and they all began moving again. The movement of his body helped David fight back some of his nerves. The stress of standing still in this place put him on edge. Even though all of them took Tylenol before they got here, his head felt as though it was splitting in half. Luckily, the headache was causing him to get annoyed about how he was being a little bitch, and someone like Trace, who couldn't even run properly, was in better mental shape right now. They reached a door marked Maintenance Only, and Trace stopped again. All right, we need in here so I can put in a hard link for the FWKs, Trace said. Brick stepped forward. The door was locked with an ID card pad. He promptly began to throw both his elbow and body into the door. It began to give in almost immediately, and David had a brief flashback to his first meeting with Brick, when he left David with deep neck bruises and punched a hole into the sedan's trunk. The door fell back after he threw himself into it for the 6th time. Trace looked up and down and then made his way towards some giant machines. They were storage wells, like human-sized computer towers, holding an unimaginable amount of data. David took a minute to study the room. It was tall and was sectioned off as a 2-story room. The bottom section, which is where they were currently standing, was filled up with the giant computers that were the size of some of those first computers ever made way back in the 19th century. Only these were modern machines with modern tech, meaning whatever these things could do no doubt was superior to anything David had ever encountered. He wondered why they needed them. The upper section, which you could look up and see part of, had a bridge walkway that left much of the space between the walls open. You could see that there were pylons on the upper section that appeared to be energy conduits for this part of the DOE building. David also realized his headache was now throbbing with an intensity he had never experienced, and severity had caused a small ringing in his right ear. Trace moved up beside one of the human-sized supercomputers and jacked a USB drive into it. Then he plugged another similar-looking device into his laptop and began to type away. A few moments had passed by when suddenly David heard something that nearly froze him in place. It took everything in his body to turn around to face the door they had just come through. It was the sound someone makes when they suck in a hard breath of air from shock. When he turned to look, it was a guard, not one that was part of the group that let them in. He was a middle-aged man sporting a mustache who was obviously losing the fight with the middle-aged gut bulge battle. He stood there with his eyes wide on the 5 on them, as he and David both stared at each other in shock. Brick was faster than all of them. He moved up to the guard before the man could make a move or sound. Brick grabbed him by the neck, like he had done to David the night prior, and using both his hands ripped the man's head almost clean off his body. The grisly death scene resulted in parts of what was inside the man's neck spilling out as Brick removed the head. The body slumped to the ground, moving around like a child throwing a fit. Brick turned and threw the head up to the second level. David heard it bounce off something up there. Ashley promptly threw up, and David had to lean against the side of the wall in silent shock from the scene. "For fuck's sake, Brick! Maybe you could have punched the guy instead," yelled Dee. "This is a giant fucking mess now. Someone is for sure going to see, and it will make our escape that much harder." Brick looked over at her with an air of minor inconvenience. It was just a reflex action. He looked down at the man's body and picked it up and dragged into the room. Trace, who missed most of the scene, stopped suddenly. "The fucking ape hit something up there that was feeding power to this data port. I need someone to see if it can be connected again. Otherwise, we are going to need to move to the secondary link point, which fucks our time frame up," Trace said with anger and a sound of sickness in his voice as he watched Brick hide the man's remains. "I'll go up and check out the thing. Just keep in communication with me so I know what I'm looking at," David said, and he made his way to the stairs that lead to the upper section of the room. Once he got up to that upper section, the ringing in his right ear got worse. It felt like someone had blown an air horn right by his ear for a few minutes straight, then stopped. It was throwing off his balance, and he had to use the railing on the side of the walkway to balance himself. He looked down over the railing to the lower section to look at Ashley. She was looking over Trace's shoulder, talking with him, trying to play it cool, but David could see her shoulders shaking. He moved over to the area where the head had been thrown. He found the man's head that had the frozen look of shock and terror of the guard who minutes ago had unfortunately found himself face to face with Brick. David pressed on the communicator in his ear. "All right, Trace, what exactly am I looking for, man?" he asked. "Those pylons up there are probably all in one way or another connected to these drives down here. One either was flipped off or broken by the head. If it was flipped off, we are lucky you can just flip it back. If it was broken, we are deep sixed in this room," Trace said. David looked around at the pylons as his head throbbed. Then he found it. The one pylon that was struck by Brick's head toss. The black orb-like emitter on top had a small hairline crack and a blood smear on it. Shocks of current escaped out of it occasionally. The manual switch attached to the beam that held the emitter in place was also coated in blood and had been flipped to the down position. David realized when Brick threw the head, he must have hit the emitter on the top, cracking it some. Then the head hit the switch as it fell towards the ground. "All right, man, I found it. The emitter on top has a hairline crack in it, and the switch was flipped. I'm going to flip the switch and see if it goes back to feeding the power into the computer for you," David said over the radio to Trace. He moved over and put his sweaty hands on the bloody switch. He heard Trace trying to say something over the radio, but he had already moved the switch to the active position. David will never be able to explain what occurred after he moved the switch into the on position. Maybe it was the fact the emitter was damaged and unstable. Maybe the sweat and blood on his hand made him more conductive. He wasn't an electrician. He didn't know how any of that crap worked. All he knew was once he flipped that switch, an electric shock, like one he never felt, ran through his body, tensing up his limbs and causing his hand to tightly clench the switch. He felt the current run through his hand and up into his head. He always thought current was supposed to move differently, but, in the moment, it was the last thought on his mind. The current moved through and up to his head, and in his pain, it felt like it dug electrical fingers into his mind and screamed, "Stop!" at him. The energy from the pylon continued to shoot through him. He began to see things in his pain. He saw a place, a utopia maybe, with a large and decorated building surrounded with a luscious environment. Large buildings shaped like the power plants of today. He saw people raising their hands and arms up to the sky at night to a full moon. He saw a bird open its wingspan. Then some other pain in his wrist happened. It was Brick. He used the guard's nightstick to bang David's hand off the switch and free him from the current that was killing him. He fell awkwardly, still getting brief flashes of the things he saw while the current had him. His body was shaking, and he felt disjointed from his own body as it twitched from the current that had ran through him. "David! Oh God, is he okay?" Ashley yelled as she ran up to kneel by him while he laid on the ground shaking, less so than before. Brick spoke up. "The current had him for about 10 seconds. He should be all right, but that was a lot of nuclear charge running through him. He needs a second," Dee shouted from the lower level. "We don't have a second. Whatever he did helped. Trace is placing the FWKs. But we gotta move to the information hub area now, before they send in people for us." Trace looked up at Dee from his laptop. "We ain't leaving him, man. If your ape says he okay, then we get him on his feet or carry him to the next spot." Dee turned around to face Trace. Then Ashley broke in by asking Brick a question. "How do you know he'll be okay? It was nuclear energy, wasn't it? Knew a couple guys back when they were building these power plants and pylons in Mexico City. Contractors, 3 of them got caught in the current like he just did. One guy was stuck in it for about 20 seconds. He was shaken up pretty bad, but he recovered and was fine after. The others were stuck in it longer. They became vegheads. He rode the current for 10 seconds. He'll be fine." He looked down at David, who was starting to get control of his vision now. He looked at Ashley and took a moment to make sure the words would form right as he said them. "I'm good. It's good." He looked at Brick and reached out his right hand. Brick grabbed it in his and helped Ashley pull David to his feet. He was still dizzy and overall, in his personal assessment, totally fucked up. But he could move and hold his gun. As they made their way to the next section, he considered the things that happened while he was being shocked by the pylon. The way the current moved through him, the way it felt like it was digging into his head. It was intense, to say the least. The images he saw confused him more. It was like a place he never had seen before, and he didn't understand why he saw it then. But before he could unpack his bizarre visions from his electrical trip, Dee spoke up. She had been listening to the comms of the DOE security team. "Damn it. They are sending an extra unit of emergency security from another federal government building due to radio silence over here. We have to move quick. This place will be crawling with feds," Dee yelled. They picked up their pace and got to the informational hub room Trace needed to jack into. The FWKs he had deployed into the systems had already begun to knock down firewalls, and all he had to do was walk over the digital rubble. He jacked his laptop into a PC on a desk and began to go to work. All right, man, we got something. Looks like the FWK's Des gave necks were the real deal. Shit is icing right through the firewalls," Trace said. David moved up behind Trace, as did Ashley, to watch him go to work. "Make sure to stream this intel over to the secure drive too. If you can," Ashley said. Trace nodded in agreement as his screen flicked from one window to the next, his fingers moving quick. David studied this for a moment and realized it was almost like a late 1990s hacker movie. But Trace broke the mystic when he stopped and looked up. "All right, firewalls down." David rolled his eyes, which ached to move still. "This is the part you were supposed to say, 'I'm in' or something hacker cool like that." Trace snorted, and even Dee looked over her shoulder. "What are you, a fucking 5-year-old or something?" David took slight offense to that, who didn't want to hear a hacker say something like that in a real-world situation. But before he could reply, Trace spoke under his breath, pulling David's attention back to the screen. Trace had stumbled on a memo that was titled, "Official 2055 Annual Review of Energy Extracting Devices, EEEDs, and Effect on Population and Energy Consumption." There it was, like looking at a piece of the holy fucking grail. EEDs, or as the Department of Energy's memo said, energy extracting devices. They had one piece of the puzzle that David wanted to put together. And even though the cavalry was on the way, he needed to read this, while Trace began to upload it to his own private servers. David's eyes flashed down to the second paragraph of the memo report. PowerPlant network reports energy extraction and collection from devices within the general public are showing a solid pull of 0.004 from each individual within its area. As always, based off the reports given by the UCA Commonwealth's medical branches in relation to ChemFarm's assessment of Chembal's effectiveness with staving off the population's mental side effects, we can look to increase possible extraction draws. If ChemFarm can address population drops, we can avoid increasing the extraction draws and instead keep the extraction limited. Social Dynamics Department has also begun pushing to get more and more populations into urban and metropolis areas to better draw from out-of-reach individuals. Companies Census Tech and Arrowgate Solutions are entering the rural sections of China, Russia, and Western Asia to help reach populations that have for too long avoided PowerPlant-based technology. We can expect within another 10-year time frame energy extraction devices to be accessible in nearly all corners of the world, as populations are moved into preferred environments. David stopped in shock. They use technology to extract energy from us, like fucking living batteries or cattle? Trace and Ashley both stood in silence for a moment, as the information was copied on the secure drive Trace had prepared earlier. That can't be true, man. How is it possible? Trace said, defiance rising in his voice. Move down to the lower half of the memo, or try to pull something up relating to the PowerPlants in particular, came Dee's voice. David looked over, and he saw it in her eyes, the look of someone who had learned something that shook the fabric of their reality. As Trace was uploading the files, he frantically was trying to skim through quickly, but time was running out for them. There, open that one, Trace, Ashley said as she pointed at the screen with her finger. Trace clicked on a file, and it opened. It was titled, PowerPlant Network Expansion 2055 Review. Again, David read quickly, hoping this may give them some insight. In all, 40 more PowerPlants were installed within the global network this calendar year. Pylons will be installed to further the outreach and relay for EEDs throughout the world to channel them through to the network. As it stands currently, EEDs are successfully extracting enough energy for efficient global energy supplies. As always, 90% of nearly all energy extraction is transmitted throughout the network to NP1 site. The 10% that remains within the network system is more than enough to satisfy current population energy usage. David paused. NP1 site? You think that's a power plant? He looked at Ashley. I guess it would make some sense that it would be, right? I bet most of them have names like that, Ashley said. David looked back down at Trace. How much of this data are you collecting? He asked. Trace looked up at him. All of it, man. I'm saving it on the laptop and I'm feeding a copy over to the device that linked up the cams on our heads too. Cool, David said. We need to learn where NP1 is. Trace looked at him with squinted eyes. Why do we need to know that shit? He asked. Because, David replied. If we get out of here, that has to be our next target. Trace turned his whole body in the seat to face David. The fuck you mean our next target? The hell it is. Next one of the DOE hit, not a power plant. You dumb shit. You got a death wish? Trace yelled, but David ignored it. Because at the same time Trace finished his sentence, Brick yelled out, The fucking feds, and began shooting his shotgun. David, Ashley, Dee, and Brick all hid, each one finding a place that provided them the ability to cover the door into the informational center, affording Trace time to finish the upload as quickly as he could. The feds had in fact shown up in force and were raining bullets down. It wouldn't be long before they realized they needed to call in SWAT forces with tear gas. As David took aim from the cover of his position, he began rapidly firing shots from his rifle. At the same time, he heard the sounds of people screaming and knew there was a possibility some of those shouts came from bullets he was firing. Trace yelled out, It's done, let's get out of here. The four of them that had been posted up in defensive positions around the entrance took turns moving away from the door as they made their way to the other exit. They ran through the door quickly, shutting it and barricading it as quickly as they could. Bullets ripped through the fake wood of the door from the other side, and they began to run through the hallways. No way the old man with the truck can be relied on for pickup. We need to get out on our own, Dee said, as they ran through the building trying to get to an exit. We can jack one of the rides they showed up in, Brick said in regards to the federal guards that were chasing them. They ran through a few more halls before they reached two conjoined doors that lead to another section. David ripped the doors open so they could run through and came face to face with a man in full SWAT gear. The man let off a riot shotgun right into David's chest. David went flying back. David couldn't take a breath. His vision was reduced to a dark tunnel as the world was fading away from the pain, and he couldn't hear much around him. He touched his chest, where he had been shot. The bulletproof vest had been ripped apart, but he didn't feel any blood. David had just realized that he had been shot with rubber bullets, and the SWAT team rained down crowd control rounds on the rest of the team like they had done to him. Trace fell into a fetal position, covering his face. Dee took about 6 shots from the rubber bullets before she went down. Ashley was struck on the side of the head with the butt of a gun and went down hard. Brick took what looked to be about 4 rounds from 5 different SWAT officers with heavy-duty shotgun rubber bullets before they got him down. They moved each of them into separate holding rooms. The room David was in had a chair next to a white table. The table had a metal bar on it that allowed handcuffs to be wrapped around it, keeping the person stuck to the table. Which, in this case, was David. He could finally breathe again, but the reality of being caught was beginning to sink in. A man wearing a black suit with a small UCA flag pin sat on the other side of the table of David reading a folder. He looked up after a moment and looked him in the eye. "Well, Mr. Nash, you have been very busy these last several days, running from the SDT, hijacking a flashing line, killing an honest man in cold blood, then breaking into a federal government building to steal classified information." His voice was one of those forgettable male voices that you could mistake for any one other person's. David looked at him hard. "You are using people like fucking cattle, even yourself. What the hell is wrong with you people?" he barked. David realized just how angry he was about the whole thing, and now sitting opposite someone involved made the venom in his body come out. The man seemed to wave off David's statement. "Don't worry, Mr. Nash. You are a chemically unbalanced individual, as are your partners, Miss Ivy, and that street rat who only has an alias, Trace. Once the SDT agents who are overseeing your case arrive, you all will be sent off for reassignment." David felt the blood rush out of his face. Reassignment? That's where this all stood. They got this far just to be sent off to be reassigned and become slave labor in a power plant? The man looked down at his smartwatch and smiled. "Ah, looks like those agents have just arrived. If you'll excuse me, Mr. Nash, I need to greet them. I'll return shortly." The man stood up and promptly left the room. David looked around quickly, taking in his environment. The door was locked, that was for certain, and there were no windows. As David tilted his head back in frustration, he realized the room's ceiling was made of cheap, removable tiles. If he could get up there, he could get out. He looked back down at his hands, cuffed, and wrapped around the metal bar on the table. Feelings of hopelessness filled David with dread. Almost as quickly as those feelings began to overtake him, a solution began to form in his mind. David hopped up to his feet, his legs and body aching from all the crap he had been through so far. He jumped up on the table and folded his left hand with his thumb curled inside his palm. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, then lifted his left foot as high as he could and brought it down as hard as possible on his left hand. He felt something crack, knew he broke at least one bone and bit back a scream. But there would have to be more if he was going to slip out of the cuffs. He did it again, harder, and again, and again. The pain was so intense, he stopped once to dry heave from the sickening feeling it filled him with. Looking down at his mangled left hand, bloody from where the skin broke under the boots he was wearing. He took several sharp, quick breaths and brought his foot down again. This time, he felt it. The bone in his hand gave way completely, and he couldn't stop himself from letting out a yell, but he was able to shakily remove his left hand from the cuff and move away from the metal bar. He stood upright on the table and used his good right hand to move a ceiling tile. Then he leaped up, using his upper body to climb into the ceiling. He knew where he had to go and what he had to find. He had to do it quick. He had one shot, and it required waking a sleepy and seriously pissed-off giant.